Has the United States reached peak MAGA? Are the Democrats justified in their optimism about the midterm elections? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Rick Perlstein. Rick Perlstein is the author of 4 books. These include Before the Storm, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Award for History, Nixonland, which Newsweek called the best book written about the 1960s, and most recently, Reaganland, winner of the Sidney Hillman Prize. His political journalism has appeared in, among others, the New York Times and The Nation. A frequent commentator on cable news and historical documentaries, Rick Perlstein serves as president of the board of the Progressive magazine in these times. Rick Perlstein, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Mouin, it's a pleasure and an honor to be discussing this stuff with you.
Thank you. And I'd like to start most obviously, perhaps, with your assessment of the US midterm election results. Has either party or faction within either party, in your view, emerged as a clear winner or loser in these elections? And if so, what brought this about? And if not, why not?
Yes, of course, in politics, expectations are everything. And it really does seem to be the case that the Democrats beat the expectations.
Mm-hmm.
The discourse in America in the weeks leading up to the election was that there would be a quote unquote red wave, which of course refers to the Republican Party, the Conservative Party. And there was talk of them winning 20, 30, 40 seats in the House of Representatives, which would really give them operational control and do things like, shut down all the investigations of the Trump administration. But pretty much the two sides fought to a draw. And there's, 2 ways you can look at that. You can say, wow, the Republicans are, in great shape for the presidential election coming up in 2024. Maybe they can do some more legislating, if they pick off a couple of Republicans by kind of choosing clever wedge issues, things like that. But there's another way you can look at it in kind of the long view, which is, of course, as a historian, I always prefer. And that's that, we do have one political party in America which has really abdicated the values of democracy, abdicated the idea that government exists, to promote the general welfare, and has surrendered to its most vicious and even violent extremes. And the fact that they're able to kind of use so much disinformation, and of course they control strong channels of different disinformation for example, the form of the cable station Fox News, and that they only, the Democrats can only fight them to a draw, is dismaying, right? Democrats have to do better for the sake of the planet, for the sake of civilization, for the sake of a strong, robust, fair economy. So I would say in the short term, it's good news. Whether they can kind of convert that into long-term strategic capacity that can really lead to the kind of transformation America needs, that's an open question.
But as far as you're concerned, no clear winners or losers.
I mean, I would say, again, Democrats win in the short term, definitely. Yeah. And, momentum is important, especially going into a presidential election year, which is in 2 years.
Yeah. And turning now to your work as a historian, which you just mentioned, your work has examined how conservatism came to dominate the American political arena, and specifically how the Republican Party has shifted increasingly to the right. Within this context, how would you situate the 2022 elections within this broader trajectory? And what are your expectations looking forward? Do you concur with those claiming that we have this week reached peak MAGA?
It's a very interesting question. And, of course, the problem with a historian doing punditry is it's always wait and see, and we don't know yet. It's like Joe Enlai saying, asked what he thinks of the French Revolution. We don't know yet.
Too early to tell. Yeah.
Too early to tell, but very interesting things are happening, as I'm sure your viewers and listeners know. The ascendancy of Donald Trump within the Republican Party, MAGA, Make America Great Again, really had, these kind of definitely authoritarian and possibly fascist elements. And Donald Trump himself, as an actor in the election, was very much kind of set back on his heels. He has a rival for the 2024 election right now, the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, and we can kind of drill down on that for the minute. Ron DeSantis scored a famous victory. He got 60% of the vote. And they
for his re-election as Florida.
For his re-election as governor of Florida. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's so significant is that he does seem to have presidential ambitions. And he really kind of built his appeal on some of the same themes that Donald Trump did. Lots of vicious scapegoating of all sorts of minorities, be they, sexual, be they religious, be they ethnic, right? He's the guy who sent refugees from Venezuela, on a bus, up to Massachusetts, to try and kind of troll the liberals. And the fact that he did so well is bad for Donald Trump, but it may be good for kind of the energies that Trump set into motion. And for a long time now, people have been worrying what happens when a politician with the same sort of authoritarian energies as Donald Trump, but who is smarter, competent, better at building and stewarding power, less impulsive, comes to the fore. And that may be what we're looking at in a figure like Ron DeSantis.
So would you characterize it as perhaps we've reached peak Trump, but we're not yet near peak MAGA?
Well, Trump, yes, peak MAGA would be Trumpism, right? But
in terms of the agenda,
MAGA would look like a totalitarian takeover of the sort we saw in Nazi Germany, I think, right. Rounding people up into camps. So I'm gonna forswear on the idea of peak MAGA. Right. But we have not broken the back of those energies. Mm-hmm. That's for certain.
And just to return to a point you mentioned earlier, which is cable news and so on. Mm-hmm. To what extent do you see, let's say, Murdoch's empire, right, Fox News, and the rest of it as a significant force, not only in promoting conservatism, but also in choosing kind of, who the leader of this movement?
Yes, well, they're a very profound force because they create not just Fox News, but also the radio shows people listen to, the podcasts, but really kind of anchored in Fox News, kind of creates this entire reality bubble for tens of millions of Americans. And it's really just this profound disinformation. I mean, if you talk to someone whose source of information was Fox News, and there are many, many, because of course they encourage the idea that the rest of the media is fake, right? You would think that, major American cities were all kind of in flames. You can't walk down the street without getting shot. And this absolutely absurd. Do you think, how many of your viewers are aware of the conspiracy theory involving litter boxes in school classrooms? It's absolutely bonkers. It turns out that kitty litter, the stuff that your cat uses, is useful if you have to kind of bivouac in a classroom because there's like a shooting or something like that. So literally, there's schools that have to store kitty litter. And somehow that became a conspiracy theory that school classrooms have litter boxes for children who identify as cats. And you can find people walking down the street who believe this. It's a complete invention. And of course, it's, it's horrifying, kind of raises all sorts of disgust in your mind. But that's how authoritarians work, the spread of disinformation. So yes, Fox News is very important to this entire apparatus. Now, who is going to be leading it? That's very interesting. And we're kind of on a hinge point. It really does seem from another property that Rupert Murdoch owns, the daily paper in New York, the New York Post, that they seem to be going after Donald Trump.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a lot of Führer principle going on the right. That always kind of has been the case. You know, George W. Bush was the hero. You know, he was elevated almost as like a terrestrial god until Iraq started going south, and you know there was a terrible hurricane in Louisiana that he couldn't handle, and then suddenly everyone and also that he proposed a comprehensive liberal immigration reform, and then afterwards conservatives acted like they'd never seen him before. So these things can really turn on a dime, and we may be at one of those hinge moments. And Donald Trump obviously is not helping his case because you know, he's having this insane narcissistic meltdown. I mean, that happens all the time, but this one seems even more bizarre than usual. Of course, he has his own social media company, Truth Social. He posted a series of messages on his social media that were just absolutely just unhinged. He seemed to have admitted to something like a crime, you know, like putting his finger on the scale of Ron DeSantis's early election, all sorts of stuff like that, and he erased them later. So strange things are going on. Watch this space.
Yeah, and the, let's say the right wing stratosphere or whatever
Yeah, the infosphere.
Yes. Rick, as you've written, race and religion have been central to contemporary politics in the United States. So my question is, how and why did culture wars and identity politics become so important in an era that has been largely marked by rising economic insecurity? Or are issues of race and religion complementing rather than displacing debates on economic and foreign policy?
That's such a rich question, and it's really the kind of question that fills libraries. You know, I mean,
try to fill a podcast with it. So.
Yeah, let's give it, you know, kind of a good 5 or 10 minutes at least. But I mean, if you look at the kind of general thrust of, you know, American liberalism, you know, the rise of the Democratic Party as the dominant force in America, it happened after, you know, the Great Depression, in which the economy collapsed. And, you know, Franklin Roosevelt, the great liberal president, built the modern American state. He built our social insurance program and won the loyalty of, you know, wide swaths of working class America. And the book of mine that's most relevant to this is called Nixonland, which covers the 1960s. And it's about how Richard Nixon began breaking the back of this coalition by weaponizing and exploiting the divisions that had always been there.
The so-called Southern strategy.
Southern strategy. So it's a very strange perversity of American politics that this supposedly liberal, kind of vaguely working class social democratic party was also the party of Southern segregationists. And in this long, slow process that was accelerated by Richard Nixon, as African Americans were enfranchised by increasing civil rights in the 1960s by the Democratic Party, which kind of made a conscious choice that, you know, it was going to become the party of civil rights. Southerners, segregationists, and conservatives generally in the South began flocking to the Republican Party. And Richard Nixon kind of made that a key part of his strategy, the Southern strategy, as you say, talking about how he wasn't going to, you know, strictly enforce the civil rights laws. And Ronald Reagan, you know, advanced that project. And so when it used to be every Southerner voted for the Democrats, and now every white Southerner, now that all the blacks could vote, you know, votes for the Republicans, and African Americans generally vote for the Democratic Party. And that's just really accelerated as a strategy of the Republican Party. The more they could make issues about elections about, you know, which of your neighbors you can't trust, you know, more about tribal identity, the less people will vote on questions of, you know, how the government is going to redistribute resources to create a strong middle class. Because, of course, the real engine of the Republican Party is a certain vision of plutocracy, you know, low taxes for corporations, stripping away social insurance protections, raising business up as kind of the drive train of society, prerogatives for rich people, right? So that's the basic order of battle for American politics since the 1960s. And like so much of Donald Trump's accomplishment, he took kind of what was already present in the Republican coalition and just kind of turned it up to a much higher and more intense degree. Such was the case that it used to be under kind of the Reagan paradigm, the sort of racism, bigotry, tribalism was kind of sotto voce. It was kind of spoken in code, right? So you would talk about, like Richard Nixon talked about the silent majority of Americans. Well, this was code phrase because you talk about African Americans in America, they're called minorities. So he's saying, I'm going to support the white people. But if he said, I'm going to support the white people, that would be gauche. He would have been, kind of called a foul. But, the difference is Richard Nixon, he didn't use these, what we call dog whistles, pitched on frequencies that only some people can hear. He used the train whistle. So, his first speech announcing his candidacy, he didn't say, I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to restore America to its former glory, which can very much be seen as kind of a pro-white kind of code phrase. He said, Mexico is sending their rapists. Mm-hmm. So the racism, and he immediately, of course, announced that he was going to, ban emigration from majority Muslim countries and that sort of thing. So the Democrats, and then, simultaneously, the Democrats lost faith in some of their social democratic energies, in the wake of Reaganism and in the wake of his success doing a lot of this. And so, ideological entrepreneurs pushed the Democrats to become more corporate friendly, which made it harder for them to attract working class voters.
And that found, I think, its greatest expression in the Clinton presidency.
Yes, the Clinton presidency. He spoke about triangulation. So he was going to be halfway between the Democrats and the Republicans, which is a very strange kind of strategy to build a power party, because you're basically saying, elect me, the Democrat, because I'm not like those other Democrats. Right. And it's very successful, but it's a short-term strategy, and it's very selfish. And the Democrats, became largely a party of, kind of cosmopolitan, well-educated people who don't think necessarily as much in tribal terms. So that's really the order of battle of American politics. And it's really kind of an interesting transition movement, because in a lot of ways, Joe Biden, who was kind of part of this Clinton movement, in fact, in the 1970s, was one of the pioneers in kind of meeting the Southern segregationists kind of halfway when it came to school segregation, has cast his lot in ways that people on the left didn't necessarily expect with them. He's really pushed things like anti-monopoly politics. He's beefed up, enforcement of labor rights and union rights. But it's really kind of a war position kind of within the Democratic Party right now, which kind of shape it's going to take. A lot of the people running the Democratic Party are extremely old, right? And they haven't been as gracious as they could be, kind of stepping aside for a new generation.
You're thinking of people
who kind of grew up, under the neoliberal regime and really, feel like they got the raw end of the stick. So it's a very interesting movement in American politics. And then, of course, the background to all this is the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality, which was, exacerbated over the last several decades.
And what about, we've spoken about race. What about religion? Because much of your work also centers on the rise of the evangelical and Christian fundamentalist movement. And if I could just add one point to that, what we've seen in recent years, which is something that I think was very much under the surface, if not absent in previous decades, was the renewal of anti-Semitism fairly openly at times in American political life.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the kind of tribal order of battle of American politics, let's even go back a century. People have heard about the Ku Klux Klan. They had a revival in the 1920s that was profoundly anti-Catholic, right? And the thing about, the way reactionary politics always works is, the things you say about the supposed internal enemy sound the same, right? They have the same structure, they have the same rhythm, the names change. It might be Jews, it might be Catholics. in the 2000s, it was Muslims. There was the terror that America was going to be blanketed with so-called Sharia law was very similar to the idea that secret communists were infiltrating the government, or Jews were infiltrating the government, or Catholics were infiltrating government. The idea that they have this loyalty not to the nation, but in the case of Catholics, for example, to the Vatican. And the rise of kind of the mostly Pentecostal, but also Catholic right wing in the 70s and 80s, in a lot of ways kind of became a substitute for the open segregation and racism, right? But it was always kind of this very conservative vision of society, almost a theocratic vision of society. And that's had a lot of interesting kind of twists and turns. Obviously, Donald Trump was not, someone you would uphold as a kind of a godly man, but at the same time, some very clever theological thinkers, picked up their Bible and managed to figure out a way to create an alibi. He's like King Cyrus, right? Who God chose, to rescue the Jews after the destruction of the temple, or David, the prophet David, who did some hanky panky with Bathsheba, and said he was going to grab her, So they've been able to kind of weaponize a vision of society that really comes down to a sort of supremacy philosophy, right? That Christians are are being victimized by this kind of cosmopolitan multicultural world that hates them, and that we need basically strongmen, Caesar types, in order to protect us. And every Republican politician seeks to fulfill that role. And Donald Trump was upheld as God's chosen vessel for Christian America. And in the purely transactional sense of politics, he fulfilled their expectations. He appointed judges that opposed abortion, that opposed the right, that upheld the right of people not to serve gays and lesbians, things like that. And he just basically, they whispered in his ear, and he kind of did what they said, just as a, part of his coalition. And again, with these people, the leadership is now again up for grabs. And as far as the anti-Semitism goes, Donald Trump and his avatars, some of whom lost, but some of whom won last Tuesday. Someone who looks like she lost was someone named Boebert from Colorado, but someone who won, J.D. Vance, right, who has this kind of Christianist, kind of supremacist ideology.
Senator from Ohio.
Is a senator-elect from Ohio. Once Donald Trump unleashed a lot of these energies, some of the most extreme elements in the United States came to the fore, and a lot of them were anti-Semitic, and the same sort of anti-Semitic ideologies that Jews secretly control the world, right? One of the conspiracy theories is that Jews are trying to flood America with pliant, brown-skinned immigrants. That's
Is this a great replacement theory?
A great replacement theory has come to the fore in a way we haven't seen since the 1940s, since the extermination of the Jews of Europe, which really kind of made anti-Semitism and not a respectable thing to talk about in America. So in that sense, we're going backwards. And speaking to your audience, brothers and sisters, Jews and Arabs right now are the scapegoats, right? So this is one of these moments in which there's very much a divide and conquer strategy going on.
And I'd like to now turn back again to the election, and I'd like to read a recent tweet of yours, in which you said, "When the opposition, meaning the Republican Party, is organized around doing nothing to help human beings, runs lunatics, and abandons a basic pretense of commitment to democracy, and the result is a tie, this is a demonstration of the weakness of the Democratic Party, not its health," end quote. You've spoken a bit on this issue earlier today, but could you elaborate on what, in your view, accounts for this weakness by the Democratic Party?
Sure. It's not a simple, it's not a simple question. You ask good ones. But just I want to talk about, first of all, just to kind of set a baseline of my claim that the Republican Party doesn't care about human beings. One of the parts of Barack Obama's healthcare reform, which was passed in 2010, was that the federal government would subsidize the states so that more poor people could get free medical care.
Mm-hmm.
It would be absolutely free for the states. No more tax. They wouldn't raise the taxes. It wouldn't come from their treasuries. It was free money. And like a dozen states controlled by Republicans, their legislators and governors said, we don't want this money. We don't want free medical care for
the residents.
Yeah. It's like, we'll just, we'll keep them tired and sick, right? Now,
because that's socialism.
That's socialism, right? It makes people dependent on the government. Well, it makes them free from their employers, whims, right? This is just basic social democracy. Now, just to kind of give one example of many, one kind of category of why the Democrats have not been effective counters to this, it totally blindsided the Obama administration. They never imagined that people wouldn't accept this free money because, there's a certain kind of refusal to get their mind around just how extreme the Republican Party has become. I mean, you listen to any speech by Joe Biden, including his quite forceful speech right before the election about America's democracy crisis, that, people are trying to delegitimize the electoral system itself. He will always say, oh, but most Republicans are really decent folks, and I really like working with them. So there's this kind of strange mixed message that the Republican Party, which is true, is seeking to subvert democracy, but also I really want to work with them and they're good partners, right? So there's a certain kind of culture of hyper politeness, consensus, a refusal to see politics as a battle, to recognize that there are people who do not have the American people's interests at heart, and they have to be not accommodated, but defeated. Right. So that's the culture of the Democratic Party. It's kind of too polite for its own good. It's like the old joke, a liberal is someone who won't even take their own side in an argument. And Obama really kind of upheld that sort of ethic, right? His wife at the convention in 2016 said, when they go low, we go high, right? And another thing is the Democratic Party, through reasons that we've discussed, but also because, in a lot of ways, the old kind of social democratic Keynesian formulas didn't seem to work kind of either politically or economically in the 1970s and 80s, really kind of went to the right, let's say the center, on economic questions. Things like free trade, so the idea that, kind of capital can move freely, and, kind of good, solid, say factory jobs that pay well and are, have union protections are not worth preserving, right? If those jobs are done in China or in Vietnam by people who get 10 cents an hour instead of $10 an hour, that's okay, right? So there was kind of a neoliberal turn among the Democratic Party, and finally the culture of the Democratic Party, because it is sort of a pluralist and not particularly ideological party, it's always had a hard time fighting a party, which is the Republican Party, which has become much more sort of apocalyptic and Manichaean in its thinking. So
and more explicitly ideological.
Much more explicitly ideological, and really kind of seeing what they're doing is fighting for last things, that they're fighting, basically good versus evil. And one consequence is that, and you can read this all in all my books, is that they've always been very good strategic long-term thinkers, right? So if, like just
the Republicans.
The Republicans. So let me give you an example. Ronald Reagan was elected, on this conservative platform in 1980. And it was much like kind of the situation between 2008 and 2010. He inherited a recession and did not end the recession. In fact, it got worse. And much as happened, in 2010 with Barack Obama, 1994 with Bill Clinton, the Republicans swept the congressional off your elections. And so when that happens to the Democrats, they say, oh, we hear you, we'll moderate, we'll change course. Ronald Reagan gave a very famous press conference right after that election in 1982, in which his party suffered these great setbacks, and he said, we're gonna stay the course. Mm-hmm. Right. So we have certain ideological commitments, we have certain principles, we're not going to change. Right. In fact, they often doubled down on their principles. And a lot of times that's catastrophic. Right. I mean, certainly, you know, in something like, you know, the Iraq War or something like that. But politically, it really gives the voters a sense that they know who they're voting for. That's a very strong brand identity. And often people ask, what does the Democratic Party stand for? Because after they lose an election, they say, well, let's change, let's do a poll. You know, Bill Clinton was very famous for, you know, building his entire 1996 election around proposals that all came from polling, focus groups, and often there were these silly little things. Oh, maybe I should support children in public schools wearing school uniforms, right? Whereas the Republicans are saying, we're going to end people's dependency on government. You know, we're going to make America great again. These very strong, big ideas. So, you know, Democrats are full of technocrats. They always know to the micromillimeter what the polls are saying that instant. But that's not a great
focus group.
A government by focus group. And that's not a great way to build, you know, power. They don't build institutions. They don't build infrastructure. They don't build Fox News. Right. In fact, you know, when Barack Obama first became, I'll back up. When Fox News first began kind of coming to the fore as a real power in Republican politics, you may be aware that their slogan was fair and balanced, right, which was propaganda, right? And a lot of Democrats pointed out, I would say liberal activists pointed out, that if Democratic politicians boycott Fox News and refuse to go on their interview programs, refuse to go on their discussion programs, they would degrade their ability to brand themselves as fair and balanced. And they would not be able to function as a simulation of a news channel. They could have, you know, nipped Fox News in the bud. But the elite of the Democratic Party, who kind of see this, and a lot of this is sociological, these are their friends at, you know, kind of Washington cocktail parties. You hear Joe Biden talk about his friends in the Republican Party. You know, they said they were horrified by this. It was much too kind of combative, right? So Republicans are always thinking about how we can, where does democratic power come from, and how can we degrade those institutions, the universities, liberal churches, right? They'll try and kind of, you know, take over the church conventions that institute liberal policies, schools, teachers unions themselves, right?
The kind of strategic thinking that you're describing.
Strategic thinking versus tactical thinking. So, you know, the party that does, to a much greater degree, uphold kind of these cosmopolitan humanitarian values, again, doesn't always take their own side in an argument.
And given the problems that you've just identified with the Democratic Party establishment, do you believe progressive Democrats have a more compelling agenda? Do you think they have, additionally, do you think they have a realistic prospect of becoming the center of gravity within their party in the same way the Republican Party was captured by the New Right, and ultimately in playing a significant role in national politics?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question as well. I mean, there is a cadre of younger Democratic public officials. You know, the most famous is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, known as AOC. And she's this young, attractive, media-savvy person who, in a lot of ways, reminds me of Ronald Reagan before he kind of came to power, in her ability to kind of speak American, speak to ordinary people, choose an ideological vision and stick to it, choose a popular vision and stick to it, because a lot of, you know, what the things they're calling for, you know, much higher taxes for rich people, which are, you know, very popular with voters, not necessarily so popular with donors. So on the one hand, you do have this exciting young generation, but on the other hand, you kind of have this kind of generation of, you know, baby boomers who run the Democratic Party, who've kind of been reluctant to step aside. And their political identity was forged in the trauma of Reagan having kind of defeated the New Deal.
So
And
is
their
this irresistible
caution is
force
kind of
meet-
their caution is kind of bred in the bone.
Yeah.
So
Is-
this is the battle. This is the fight.
And is this a situation where irresistible force meets immovable object, or do you see potential
Well, you know, the
prospect
thing about old people is they, you know, let's not
tend
be
to leave?
morbid about it, but you know, they tend to pass from the scene.
Yes.
So I mean, I think it's kind of inevitable because, you know, a lot of the kind of neoliberal nostrums that, you know, Democrats were compromising with in the 80s, 90s, 2000s just make no sense for the new generation. You know, I mean, these are people who graduate from college with massive student debt. Baby boomers went to college in the United States under a much more social democratic system when college was free quite often, right? And, you know, so this is a really great example of strategic capacity, right? The Republicans wanted, you know, a lot of right-wing economists were like, wow, if we change the way the entire society finances higher education with loans, right, that kind of get individuals, you know, on the hook with debt instead of the state, you know, just kind of shoveling money to these institutions. It's a much more individualistic, kind of non-liberal way to fund higher education. And so now these students are graduating into a world in which their economic prospects are just nothing like their parents, let alone their grandparents. So it's a very hard sell to tell them, oh, well, you have to moderate because we have to reach these voters in the center. Say, no, I'm in the center, right? My experience is central.
And you do see the Democratic Party as being conducive to this kind of changing of the guard.
No,
If you will.
I think it really is a battle that's kind of being fought out kind of on the ground. And you know, the people who are in charge of, you know, slating candidates, you know, just to give an example, one of the powerful these powerful 80-year-old Democrats is a guy named Steny Hoyer, and he's the guy who invented the Rolodex test, which is like when a candidate came to him and said he was the head of basically the funding operation for the Democratic Party and said, I want to run for Congress, governor, you know, city council, he would say, okay, take out your phone and show me how many people in your contacts can give the maximum $5,000 donation, right? Which obviously attracts a certain kind of candidate. And, you know, in a lot of ways, the fact that, you know, the young people are, you know, just much more free of this kind of thinking is great. But on the other hand, if you're a Democrat in America, you've gotten texts, emails from the Democratic Party, from candidates over and over again, and they offer no civic vision. They know no vision of the future. All they do is beg for money. You know, we can win if I meet my fundraising goals. So there are very powerful institutional structural impediments. You know, for example, the people who are the campaign consultants, you know, they make money by placing television ads, which don't really work. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done. There are people who are doing it, but, you know, in a lot of ways, it's kind of ironic because, you know, Bernie Sanders is in a lot of ways the tribune of this rising young generation, but he's obviously a quite old guy, you know, but he's not really seen as a team player. So, you know, it's a battle and it's very interesting. It's going on right now.
And looking at it now more broadly, many people look at the United States and use terms that have often been used by American politicians to characterize foreign countries, terms such as dangerous polarization, dysfunctional government, democracy in the balance, mass shootings, and all the rest of it. So in this context, Rick, what do you make of assessments that the American political system is no longer fit for purpose and is potentially headed for a violent breakdown?
I think it's quite possible. I am not optimistic. You know, our Constitution, it's very interesting that after World War II, when, you know, there were a lot of, you know, formerly authoritarian nations that had to reconstitute new governments under kind of the supervision of the United States, like Japan and like Germany, and had to write new constitutions. No one said, why don't you try ours? You know, in America, you know, our deeply minoritarian constitution, which gives great power to rural areas, which are more reactionary, for example, don't believe in, you know, global warming and are full of people who think that liberals are should be eliminated, right? It's a terrifying prospect. And you know, a lot of, you know, like, I mean, the fact that the people who organized against Donald Trump, starting with the 2016 election, called themselves the resistance, you know, kind of parallel to the resistance to fascism in France in the 1930s and 40s. That's no accident. I mean, we were fighting very dark, very dangerous forces. You know, I like to say that the Republican Party has a parliamentary and a paramilitary wing, right? I mean, literally, you have people, you know, and this has been a long time coming as well, right? You began to see in the 1990s people saying, you know, once a Democratic president, Bill Clinton, who got no credit from these guys for, you know, compromising with conservatism, they started forming armed militias, right? Which are illegal in all 50 states, but when someone
Tolerated.
they're tolerated, exactly. So you know, I mean, I'll end by, you know, quoting Winston Churchill, you know, who, you know, obviously is a problematic figure in his own right, but had, you know, had certain sorts of democratic commitments and knew how to turn a phrase. He says, "America always does the right thing after it exhausts every other possibility." So, you know, I have hope, and I'm going to stick around and fight. But the prospects for democracy are worse than they've been in America in a very long time. In a lot of ways, you know, if you've read, you know, about the Southern Civil Rights Movement, what things are like in the South, in a lot of ways, these forces represent kind of the nationalization of the way Southern politics used to work.
That's a scary thought.
It is a scary thought. But those guys, in a lot of ways, you know, were set back on their heels. So it's the luta continua, as my Spanish would say.
And finally, Rick, I'd like to look at the impact of this election on U.S. foreign policy, if it indeed, in your view, have any impact. If we look, for example, specifically at the Middle East, some governments, such as Saudi Arabia and Israel's incoming Netanyahu government, clearly favored a Republican victory.
Right.
And the recent OPEC Plus decision to reduce oil production by 2 million barrels a day was seen by many as an open attempt by the Saudis to damage the Democrats and bolster Republican electoral prospects. Similarly, it's been suggested that the White House was loath to conclude the nuclear agreement negotiations with Iran this side of the midterms because they were worried that it would impact, you know, that it would give the Republicans electoral ammunition. More generally, do you think these elections will have any consequences for U.S. foreign policy, or is that something where you know, no, there's a Republican Democratic?
Yeah, that's a very disconcerting part about American politics. You know, if you might have heard the phrase "the blob," it refers to kind of like the center right / center left kind of foreign policy establishment in Washington that really agrees on far too much. And the idea of America kind of projecting force abroad and America as the indispensable nation is really deeply, deeply ingrained among the elites of American politics. It's very interesting that both kind of on the right and the left in America, there's a lot more skepticism about that. Whether that means there's a kind of some sort of operational kind of coalition that can be built. People are trying. There's something called Google the Quincy Institute in America, which is really a big force for kind of to basically, you know, degrade the power of what we call the military industrial complex in America, which has a lot of power. You know, they build a massive jet bomber, and these companies are very smart. You know, there's 435 districts, you know, congressional districts in America, and they'll build a factory in as many districts as possible. You know, maybe they'll make one little
job in every district.
Yeah, there's a job in every district. So, you know, they're the forces that kind of structure this, you know, are very dangerous. And of course, there's the fact that, you know, there's a lot of crying wolf in American security policy, but, you know, in a lot of ways, suddenly we do have this wolf at the door in the form of, you know, Putin and what he's up to in Ukraine. I have a very hard time. I can kind of picture an America that's a lot more just and humane when it comes to domestic policy, but I'm a lot more pessimistic about when it comes to foreign policy. And of course, again, you just have to come back to this and the carbon economy. the security situation for the whole world is the world will become a much more dangerous and frightening place as the scarcity caused by climate change begins kind of wreaking havoc around the world. So that will require some real wisdom and some real kind of forbearance when it comes to the projection of force. And I can only pray that things change in that regard before it's too late. I don't see any particular signs on the horizon that this election changed anything, but I could be wrong. You know, I mean, there could be some forces out there that are beginning to move things in a more pacific direction.
And we'll certainly keep an eye on things and see how that develops. In the meantime, Rick Perlstein, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for sharing your knowledge and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Let's check in another 2 years and see how things are going.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks.